Today's session is entitled Using Market Disruptions to Build Your Next Webinar Campaign. Today's guest speaker is Mike Agron. I'd like to introduce Mike Agron. He's a good friend of ReadyTalk and is a webinar demand generation expert, and is also the co-founder and executive webinar producer for WebAttract. WebAttract is a professional services organization that helps sales and marketing professionals associated with global and emerging brands, as well as media publishers, excel at using webinars for demand generation with less hassles. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn the call over to Mike Agron. Thanks again, Mike, and take it away.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you folks in the audience. Delighted to be here. And I just want to make a brief introduction that license plate is my real license plate in California. And I guess you could say that's my passion, webinars, and I drive around with it proudly. And I'm really excited about today's topic, about how you can use market disruptions to build your next webinar campaign. I think it's safe to say for anybody doing webinars today, it's not like it was a few years ago where you could, through the novelty of a webinar, get people to attend and register for your webinar. It takes a lot more than that, and that's what we're going to talk about. And also, about a year or so ago, we did a book with ReadyTalk called Managing the Webinar Lifecycle from Start to Finish, and I encourage all of you, it's complimentary. At the end, we'll tell you how to get it, to request a copy. Much of what I'm going to cover is, in one way or another, covered in there, and realistically, I can't cover every point in there, but I encourage you to get that. So let me move into what today is about and who it's for. It's really for webinar and demand generation professionals. And what I want to be able to do is show you how you can use market and industry disruptions to make your webinars must-have rather than nice-to-have. And that's the way to ensure that people will register and attend your webinars. It's got to be a must-have, and we'll go into that. And I also wanted to be able to share with you how you can utilize content that you already have around your thought leadership that amplifies your expertise. And finally, the end game for any demand generation webinar is to drive fresh new sales leads, promote your brand or your thought leadership, most importantly, to be able to get people to become your advocates and your customers. So with that, I'd like to now ask each of you if you would take a moment to tell me what is your webinar use case. So Sean, would you go ahead and launch the poll, and let's see how folks are using webinars on the call, and that'll give me an idea. They're using it mostly for sales and product demos, customer partner training, demand gen webinars. You're investigating webinars. You don't do webinars. So when you get some results in there, Sean, go ahead and share it, and then we'll move right into the presentation.
I sure will. I sure will. And ladies and gentlemen, if you do turn to your screens, you'll see a series of check boxes. Feel free to answer any or all of the answers that do apply. We'll give it just another moment or two to collect as many answers as we can. And I think, Mike, what I'll do is I'll open these up for you so everybody, not only you, can see the results for today's conference. And, Mike, for you, the Skip to Results button will help you see that as well. All righty.
And let's see what comes up. Excellent. Okay. So over half of you are doing webinars for demand gen. About a quarter are doing them for sales and product demos, and about a third are doing it for customer partner training, and 10% are investigating webinars. So, Sean, I hope that what you learned today will get you to move into adopt and try one. So let's get right into the topic for today. So the topic is using industry shifts and market disruptions. And I've got 4 actual case studies that I'm going to give you examples on. And I'm not a big fan of theory or academic ideas. I want to be able to share our experience and how these webinars came and how market shifts and disruptions were working. And we'll start by setting the stage on what you need to know to optimize outcomes. Again, it takes a certain amount of planning to make sure you get the right audience. Then I'll go into these 4 case studies, and I'm only going to be able to touch on some of the best practices and some of the metrics of what the results were. And I'll show you some ways to measure effectiveness in doing webinars. And then, as Sean said at the top, it's your turn to ask questions. So with that, setting the stage. And I always believe that webinars are being a live event or theatrical in nature. And so everything we do uses the theatrical metaphors of having a live event that is engaging, that keeps people attention. But regardless of what your goals in doing a webinar, there are a clarity that you need on which of the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Are you looking to raise brand awareness? Are you looking to promote your thought leadership? Are you looking to drive sales? Or is it a little bit of all three? And what you'll see in each one of these examples is that. But regardless of what your objectives are, your challenge in producing a webinar is really to create an engaging event that's going to corral and spur people who want to have a one-on-one conversation with you after the webinar to become your customer. The time for selling is after the webinar, not during it. And so if we take and look at leads, the way you'll do that is by delivering engaging webinars that get people to want to have that conversation. So the three challenges of any webinar, or the three parts of the life cycle, is first attracting an audience that will find your message to be of relevance, engaging them so they're inspired to have a conversation with you afterwards, and then to begin to qualify. Are they ready to talk, or do they need more nurturing? And I'll give you some more ideas around that. But before we do that, someone asked me, what are the three biggest webinar myths you've learned? And I would have to say in doing this for 6 or 7 years, there's three of them. These are very important. The biggest myth that needs to be debunked is the first one, build it and they will come. And nothing could be further from the truth. Why? Because I think all of us know in the B2B world, most of us want to do our research online before we want to speak to an actual salesperson. So we're constantly being evaluated whether we like it or not, or know it or not. And I put a retail store in there because I think this is kind of symbolic of what a lot of us have experienced. You know, we go into a store, we're not sure what we want, we think we have an interest in something, we just really want to look, and then some salesperson pounces on us and goes, "Hi, may I help you?" And we step back and say, "No thanks, I'm just looking." I really believe that's the way webinar audiences are today. They're in various parts of the buying cycle. The webinar is a great way to give them information. But more specifically, the reason webinars become magnets for attracting prospects is because of one of two reasons. One, like the gentleman on the left, they've got pain. They're looking for better outcomes. They have questions. They're not sure. Or, like the lady on the right, they're actively looking for a solution. These are the two phases or two stages that people are in who want to attend your webinars. And in attending your webinars, they don't want to be sold. There's a huge difference, and I think we're all aware of it, between content marketing and traditional marketing. And I'm a big fan of the Content Marketing Institute out of Cleveland. And content marketing is really about helping to educate your buyers, making them more intelligent, so you can have a more profitable customer interaction. It's not about selling them. If you've got something of value, they'll want to talk to you. And the way I distinguish that is an informational webinar is case study focused. It talks about best practices, about lessons learned. It focuses on business value, metrics, return on investment, rather than a sales pitch, which is product-centric. It talks about features and benefits and pricing. In fact, you're going to see one of the case studies just coming up that is about a product, but we hardly ever mention the product, and you'll see why. The most important thing in understanding market disruptions, and the reason I absolutely believe why you must embrace disruption, is the simple formula that I have found to be true in my entire business career. It's this: opportunity is directly proportional to confusion plus change. Think about it. The more confusion there is, or the more change, the more there is an opportunity to tell a story on how you can solve that. And specifically, one of the things that disruptive markets and industry shifts provide is the ability to tell a story beyond sound bites, to really get in and talk about something. You can highlight innovative solutions, and at the same time, it helps you promote your thought leadership. And I talk about thought leadership a lot, and it's real simple. There's an individual, his name is Mitchell Levy. He's got a thought leadership group on LinkedIn about thought leadership best practices, and he's kind of taken the leadership position on this particular area. And what I like about what Mitchell says is that when you become a thought leader, others are recognizing you for your expertise in your space, and they seek out your help. In other words, you become the go-to person, and that's an ideal way to be able to create an engaging conversation and share information. And let's take a look at what are some of the the popular thought leadership webinar themes in the B2B world. There's 3 of them. There's one on case studies around business improvements. There's how-to tutorials, and there's ones on standards and compliance. So on the case study, if you look at the one up there, this was about how Parker Aerospace was able to take advantage of existing workstations to do more simulation. And it was presented by HP and how they helped them do this. It was not a sales pitch. It was a case study. The other is a how-to. This one was about how you should look at going beyond aerospace for using composites. And a lot of manufacturers of legacy materials like bridges and things like that haven't thought of composites. So this was kind of a how-to as well as a case study on why that makes sense. And probably one of the most impactful webinar themes is anything to do with standards and compliance. And you're going to see some examples here. So when standards change or there's regulatory compliance, people want to be kept in the know. Ideal topics to do a webinar with. And I talk about content, and there's so much great content out there. It can be from white papers that you have. It can be from clients and partners. They're often a great source because they have they're excited about the results they got with your solution or working with you, and they want to tell the world about it. There's case studies. There's industry analysts, and there's publishers and editors and authors. And the thing that's so cool about all this stuff is that a white paper, a 3-page white paper, probably has enough content in it for 2 or 3 webinars. So there's a lot of great content out there. The next myth a lot of people have is, hey, you know what? I'm a great presenter. I'm just going to show up and wing it. Wrong. Nothing could be more difficult to comprehend if you've never done a presentation or a webinar in the virtual world. So, again, going back to why webinars are so great, they breathe life into content. It's a time for storytelling, but it takes practice to rehearse, to understand your timing and your facilitation, because right now, as much as I'm enjoying my time with you, I can't see any of you. So I have to make sure that I stay focused and I stay on topic and I tell a great story. And the way I like to look at this is I like to think of webinars as really radio shows but with pictures. The focal point is the speaker, not so much the visuals, but it's fast-paced and it keeps moving. And Sean, if I can just take a moment here, I know that you and I were talking right before we went live. You used to be in radio yourself. Does this analogy make sense to you?
Oh, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. As a matter of fact, this is, I can't think of anything more similar as we go through that. Those of us who are in this type of presenting situation on this side of the microphone, it's a big challenge. I've had to coach a lot of folks who have to get away from the live environment. We take so many cues from our nonverbal communication. This really has to get down to knowing your information. You got to know it inside and out. You can't have any delays in what you're talking about as though you're searching for words. You really need to hone it. One of the things that I do, and it's not for any specific topic or any different specific genre, I force myself to listen to all kinds of different talk radio, sports shows, political shows, the NPR type shows, just to get a different feel of how these guys are presenting to an audience who's not in front of them. I think it takes a lot of skill, or at least a little bit of practice, to get through and to present comfortably.
Thanks, Sean. I feel the same way. I'm a big fan of NPR and Charlie Rose and all those others. But really, what really matters is every one of you in the audience. You are the reason we're here today. Sean and I would just speak to each other if it weren't for you. So everything that we want to do around attracting an audience or engaging them is around playing to what you're interested in. And finally, I'm going to come back to this at the end. The third biggest myth is that all attendees are sales ready and they want to buy now. Again, people are in various parts of the buying cycle. They may just be interested. They may not have any need right now, but they're curious enough to know. So you have to set that expectation that not everybody that attends is ready to buy. So
Mike, is it okay if I just jump in right now? I love that last slide. I really love it.
Back to it.
Yeah, I love that number 3 because you're absolutely right. We'd love that idea. And as we talk to folks who are new to the webinar space, the idea in folks' heads, you typically is, I'm going to spread the word. I'm going to send an email out to my 100 people on my list. I'm going to get 98 people on there, and 90 are going to buy. Now, at a higher level, I like to try to think of your webinars, especially for lead generation, as great qualifiers. Do a series of these kind of things. See who tends to come back, what organizations tend to come back. I think this is one of the best qualifiers that you can get to get you writing good business, getting good sales, and getting a great match for whatever you're providing. So I couldn't agree with you more, Mike, and thanks for letting me interrupt on that. I just love using webinars as a qualifying tactic.
Absolutely. So let's jump into the first case study. So the first case study is with an organization called Bosch Healthcare. And I think it's safe to say, I would suspect that most of us in the audience or most of us online have heard of Bosch in one form or another. They're a large company out of Germany. They're well known in automotive and in other markets. And they have a play in healthcare. But let's think about it for a second. What market or industry is experiencing more disruption than healthcare? Whether you call it Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, that's just the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of all the changes going on. So there's a lot of disruption in this industry, a lot of shifts. So here was the challenge for Bosch in attracting an audience. They have a product called Telehealth Buddy, but they didn't want to do, and we coached them not to just do a webinar on that. Let's talk about something to add value, to educate the audience. So the objective was to attract an audience, to educate health-based decision makers, such as physicians, people from healthcare plans, from accountable care organizations, on how they can use new reimbursement options for telehealth services, and that would help Bosch drive product sales. So telehealth services is something that's offered where you don't necessarily have to come in to see the doctor. It's very similar to what we're doing right now. It's a virtual way of doing things. So the name of the first webinar was How You Advance Remote Patient Monitoring Through New Coding Options. Now here was the brilliance of this. What they wanted to show was their thought leadership that you could not only use telehealth to have better outcomes, but there were now new reimbursement codes available. So not only could you use it, but you could get reimbursed on it. Because if you think about it, if they couldn't get reimbursed on it, they're not going to use it. And what made this a successful webinar, both from an invitation and from the actual webinar, is that a roadmap was provided to show them how they could code for telehealth services. And then they showed them how these codes can favorably impact what's called the medical loss ratio. We had to reach a diverse audience of decision makers and network physicians who had varying degrees of interest. But what also brought it to life was industry expert accompanied an internal speaker, an industry expert or a thought leader. And that not only brings expertise, but it brings credibility. One of the things I would caution everybody on is, while you may have some great people in-house, if you can find a third party to present on your behalf, it just adds so much more credibility and interest in it, and it takes it out of being potentially an overt sales pitch. So there's their solution on the left, Health Buddy telehealth solution, and this is what was used to get them interested in it. Well, the results were we had over 630 people register, and that's a large amount for a small demographic. The targeted demographic was quite small, but you can see that there was a high degree of interest. 64% or 402 registered, attended. The attendee satisfaction, we always run a poll at the end to see what their satisfaction was, 89%. But what ended up happening with this strategy is that the Bosch Webinar Leadership Series has now become a cornerstone of their modern content marketing at Robert Bosch Healthcare. This was the first one. Since then, we've done 4. We're in production now on the 5th. And each one of them is to educate the marketplace. That's what's important. The industry shift is the disruption in the healthcare industry. Let's go to case study number 2. This is about change and confusion, and also has to do with compliance and standards. The company is out of New York, and they're called Novel, and they produce online equations for engineers to use to become more innovative in developing their solutions. The approach was not to sell on their solutions, but to educate engineers on timely topics that indirectly would support the use of analytical and search tools. So this webinar was called Designing and Verifying Safety Instrumented Systems, and why it was important and timely, talking about market shifts and disruptions. Safety news is always in the headline. I think this was around the BP disaster. So there was a lot of interest in safety. It's kind of a carrot and a stick. 3 well-known authors who were thought leaders and subject matter experts were invited to present. And they covered best practices for compliance. And they wanted to empower design engineers on how to deal with these. And they provided them a roadmap. And then from a credibility standpoint, an additional sponsor was the International Safety Association. So you had 3 well-known authors, you had all these disruptions in the market and around compliance, and we gave the audience something that they can sink their teeth in. Now here's what was really interesting. 686 registered, 51% attendance ratio, which is really strong, reached 47 countries. The attendees got so much value, they gave it a 98%. It was one of the highest I've ever seen. But as far as inspiring the audience, there were 40 post-webinar follow-up sales meetings that were scheduled immediately. But the thing about this particular webinar was, because the topic was so timely, that there were a total in the first year of about 781 on-demand viewings. If you look at that, 617 were from fresh new sales leads. 431 of the viewings happened within 6 weeks post-webinar. So I love to call webinars the content marketing gift that keeps on giving. 686 registered, but then after the webinar for the on-demand, 781 on-demand viewings, of which 617 were fresh new sales leads, was fantastic. It just spoke to the power of this topic. Now let's move to the SMB, small medium business marketplace. And this is also an interesting case study on market disruption. The company is DEX1. And if you're familiar with DEX1, you may be familiar with their prior name, which was the R.H. Donnelly Company. And their main product for years was the Yellow Pages. Now think about it. You're the R.H. Donnelly Company. You're having to find new ways to change your business model, to establish relevance in the marketplace. And you need to go out and reinvent yourself so you can not only engage your existing base, so they'll know that you're in the know about digital marketing, but you have to attract new customers. This was the challenge that DEX1 had. And we did a series of, I think we did about 17 webinars. And what we did is we educated the market. Again, it was more on helping their customers, small, medium businesses, who are anything from professionals, doctors, dentists, lawyers, to auto repair facilities, so on and so forth, learn new ways that they could get and take advantage of digital marketing, because just as Dex was hit with all these changes, so were all their customers. So one of the webinars was how to get your sales unstuck, how to get your sales growing fast. And they brought in a very well-known consultant, author, entrepreneur by the name of Barry Moltz. And he talked to the audience, not about Dex, but about how they could have better selling strategy. So he provided a tutorial. And he has this brand called the Double Helix Trap. And basically what that says is, if you're a small business, it's very difficult to both sell and deliver. And you get caught up in that track. And he gave people ways to get out of that. And he also gave them a lot of free tips. He had a sample email letter to use to get back in touch with customers you haven't spoken with in a while. And he also talked about managing social media, and there was a clear call to action. Now, the managing social media, you'll see that theme, how that carried through. But what he did is he educated the audience. So what happened? Well, 2,127 people registered, 40% attendance ratio. The average duration was 54 minutes, high attendee satisfaction. But 171 from that webinar requested a one-on-one meeting. Now, here's what was really good about that. The post-webinar voice prospecting created these sales conversations, but they were also an opening to discuss DEX1 social media reputation management program, which they had released at the same time as this webinar. And if you remember on the last slide, Barry spoke about social media. So this was a perfect tie-in to be able to go into that, and those were the amount of calls they had. Now I want to go to my fourth case study. This is one of another very interesting case study. The companies that I've talked about so far, such as Bosch, which is obviously a global brand, Novel, it's more of an emerging brand, Dex, certainly nationally known, but Mercer International is out of New Jersey. They're a regional player, and they create and produce large systems to help separate oil and water so companies can comply more with the law. So what this is about is the industry shift and the market disruption is compliance, efficiency, and risk mitigation. So what the goal here was to use these to attract and educate environmental compliance decision makers on some new innovative ways to remove oil and solids and to drive new sales for Mercer. So what they did is they brought a topic called separating the contenders from the pretenders in the world of oil-water separation. And that's a picture there of what the sludge looks like. Definitely not something that I've normally talked about at cocktail parties, but a very fascinating topic. And what they did is they took advantage, again, of the confusion and change to go beyond the status quo, to talk about trends and opportunities, where things going. And they brought in an industry expert and an internal speaker who presented together, but the industry expert presented a case study to talk about the total cost of ownership on oil and water separation and gave tips on how and what are some of the best practices to be compliant and avoid fines and citations. And they delivered on everything in the invitation. Well, this was one of the nicest, most pleasant outcomes we ever had, and you'll see why in just a second. We had 146 people register. We had a nice amount of attendance, high degree of satisfaction, but as a result of this webinar, they were selected by an attendee that was unknown to them before the webinar. They were the successful bidder to provide their solution for the first U.S. nuclear facility to be built in over 3 decades that resulted in a 7-figure sale to them. Sean, I think they paid for the webinar with this. Wouldn't you agree?
I think so. I think that's a nice outcome for that, for sure.
And actually, I received an unsolicited video from them about it, and it was just fascinating. But this is an example of how they took advantage of all the market disruptions, the industry shifts on compliance. They talked about better business outcomes, the pain points. Everything I mentioned in setting the stage was done here. Now, not every deal is going to end this way, but some of them do. But here's what you can look to have happen when you use market disruptions and industry shifts. One of the clients we work with has a survey, uses a survey at the end of the webinar to find out, based on attending today's webinar, what are your plans to purchase or acquire products or services? And there was a 26% response. If you take a look at this, this is all about moving the needle. 47% said it increased. 24% said they were just researching but now intend to acquire. 24% were just researching but they see no need, and 5% said they decreased. So 71% have an active interest in learning more to make an acquisition. This is really how a webinar should perform. And Sean, it goes back to what you said. It's a qualifier. These people are interested. They wanted to have a conversation after the webinar. Now, I talked about effectiveness at the start of my talk. Webinars impact the bottom line a lot of different ways. Obviously, net new deals is one of the easiest ways to measure and justify a webinar, such as in the case of Mercer. But it's also a wonderful way to convert prospects into customers, and that's what happened in many cases with Novel and with Dex. But it also allows you to upsell and cross-sell to your existing base, which is what the folks at Dex One did, because they were able to get in there and provide their social media options, so on and so forth. Increasing your sales pipeline is another byproduct. But another important thing is it puts you on the map as a viable player. And one of the things I love about webinars is that you can level the playing field, and you can be just as strong as a Bosch or anybody else if you've got something of value to offer. And it also allows you to reach new markets and geographies. So these are 6 ways to measure webinar effectiveness. But it doesn't just happen by accident. it has to be based on a solid methodology of deliverables, key milestones, a series of best practices, and a healthy use of metrics to measure before, during, and after the webinar life cycle to make sure your outcomes match what you want. What I'm convinced of is if you do that and you use market disruptions to build your next webinar campaign, you achieve two things. One, as it shows on the y-axis, you can meet or exceed your commercial outcomes. On the x-axis, you add value to your audience. Those are the two lines that you have to straddle. So before I get into your questions, I want to tell you some of the key takeaways from what my presentation was about. Number one, embrace disruption and change. It's the greatest thing to help you tell a story. But it's also important that in doing that you just can't go out there and wing it. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And the webinar is a great opportunity to breathe life and tell a great story around ordinary static content, such as research reports and white papers and case studies. And there's a lot of passionate third-party experts, also known as thought leaders, that would love to be on your webinar. And they're proud of what they accomplished, and they want to tell people about it. But the other thing is, and this was almost in every webinar that I mentioned here, particularly from Dex, you have to either come with the intention of giving to get rather than getting to give. Just give away information. Give people something that inspires them, that gets them excited. And always have a call to action before, during, and after. Before we go into questions, Sean, I just want to take a moment and let folks know if you want to continue the conversation with us, we have a thought leadership group on LinkedIn. We'd love to have you. We've got lots of best practices, case studies, ebooks on our website. A lot of presentations on SlideShare, and also you may be interested, we've put together a master webinar producer crash course and certification, and we're going to be announcing that after Labor Day, and I just wanted to mention that. So, Sean, let me go to the portion here that we can turn it back to the audience and ask you if you have any questions of me before we start, or if any of you'd like to add in.
Absolutely. And before we get into those questions, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have questions for Mike, please feel free to look to the bottom left of your screen. Type those questions in. Mike and I are the only ones who will see those, so if you're a little self-conscious, don't worry about it. Send those to us. We're the only ones who will see those. Once we exhaust those, we'll give you an opportunity to ask Mike a question live. And as we get into those actual questions, Mike, you and I perform similar roles here. I've been with ReadyTalk for almost 10 years now as the product trainer and corporate trainer. One of the things that I saw throughout your presentation is that continually came up was adding value, providing value. You want people to want to come to your webinars, and I think that's one of the things that was really beneficial for your case studies. These organizations provided information that people wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear about the widget. They wanted to hear about something that was valuable. They wanted to be able to absorb that and make their own decisions. That's the beauty of the information age. We can look at all the different pieces of information. We get to sift those out. And as we're going through our webinars, what we want to try to do is provide to our audience the right information, the best information, so they can make the right decision. And that hopefully that's reconnecting with you for a more qualified lead or buying product, those kind of things. So I just had to echo that again. That value proposition, I think, is paramount. It really is.
Well, thank you. And I just to add to that, when I say build it and they will come, everything you've seen here takes a tremendous amount of thought and iteration. I saw a chat in here where somebody commented, maybe it was you, that Steve Jobs said that for every minute of a presentation, it took him an hour to practice it. And what I will tell you is that to do a webinar where you're doing everything across the life cycle, from the messaging, the audience recruitment, the content development, all of that, conservatively, you need at least 1 hour for every live minute. This stuff takes a lot of time. And you being in training, you know that in training, creating training is even more. But it pays off, and you're right. Like I said, the audience is who you are there to please. Give them value.
Mm-hmm. And, in this day and age, with all of the advertising that's going on, I'm an old advertising guy. What do we see now? When we're reading the newspaper, we see an ad, we see something on the television, and we say, hey, come on in, it's free. Not really free. So we've become numb to all these messages, and for so long, webinars and all this information was really directed at a sales pitch. Buy my widget, buy my service. But now we've got the ability to provide a lot more information. People have their defenses up, and the moment that you provide them real information, they realize that, hey, this is maybe a partner in my space. This isn't somebody who's just trying to sell me something. And that transition takes a little bit of time, but I think, Mike, you've given us wonderful information to go on there.
Thanks.
With that said, we do have a bunch of questions. I'm looking at the clock. I want to make sure we can get to all these because we do have a good amount of questions. And just recently, just a couple slides ago, you had mentioned metrics. And of course, we all know the value of metrics. But as I paraphrase here, what are some others that are helpful for optimizing webinar outcomes outside of the metrics piece?
Well, there are 6 key metrics we use for webinars. The first one, and the most important, is what I call the click-through ratio. And what that does is it measures how many people came to your landing page and registered. And so if you have a 25% click-through ratio, in today's world, that's pretty good. That meant of 100 people that came, 25 registered. If you're significantly lower than that in the teens, Houston, we have a problem. If you're above that, it just says your message is resonating. So that's number one. The other one is the attendance ratio. How many people that registered will attend? I like to see 40%. The higher the attendance ratio, the more interest in your topic. I showed you the example of Bosch. I think they had 64%. That just connected with their topic. The other is engagement from how people vote in polls. You get a lot of valuable insight on what they weigh in, what's important to them, and you can also measure how many people voted. What is the response? You engage in the audience. Another one is retention. How long do you keep people? We like to see 80 to 85% of the peak audience still on at the start of the Q&A. People may not always sit through the Q&A because they have other things to do, and they may look at their watch and say, oh, this is great, I can go return some emails or calls. But that's kind of the benchmark. And then the fifth one is the qualitative side. How did today's webinar meet your expectations on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the best? You want to see where that is, and finally, on-demand using. So those are the 6 key webinar metrics, and I do have a slideshow presentation that talks all about it if anybody's interested. So those are the 6 key ones, and those go above and beyond email metrics.
Gotcha. Here's a neat follow-up question on that. As you were mentioning click-throughs and getting people to recognize the message. I'll just paraphrase. How tightly do the titles of your webinar help you, push that needle to click-throughs and get the higher ratios instead of having people read through the full description? Where do you sit with that in the titles and how that connects there?
I think the titles are extremely important. However, it's the subject line. Because when you come to your inbox, we all come to our inbox, it's going to be brimming with fresh new emails. Does that subject line capture your interest enough to at least want to click and open it? Because if you don't open it, there's no way you're going to take any action. So I believe the subject lines are the most important part of the webinar. Certainly the title has to be relevant, but the subject line is number one. And changing your subject lines up for every drip or blast that you do is important.
Great point. Great point. On that note, one of the audience members would like to hear you speak a little bit about the importance of promoting these events outside of your email list. We were talking about subjects in your emails. What's some of the importance of promoting outside of that, and where might you recommend those?
Well, what we do, and I'm glad to answer that question because every one of these webinars here really went outside the house list. If you're going to attract an audience and you want fresh new prospects or fresh new sales leads, you need to go out beyond your house list. And so a rule of thumb is we look at the messaging and we create a value proposition around the messaging and look for about 50,000 matched demographics to that messaging. So when we were in the case of Novel, we're looking for engineers, engineering directors, engineering managers. We don't want to go to people in sales or business development because they're not interested. We target them, and we execute that campaign 3 weeks before we go live. We'll do about 4 different drips or blasts, and we'll suppress each one of the blasts with certain information on, we don't want to go to the people that opened it and hit them again. We'll wait to the end. So that is the way to attract an audience. And the number is, and listen to this, on 50,000 names, 1/4 to 1/2 or 1% should register. So on 50,000 names, that's 125 to 250. Mm-hmm. And there's a big range there. Now, what's the driver? Your click-through ratio. Your click-through ratio will tell you every time if you're going to hit your numbers. If you have a high click-through ratio, you're going to probably hit your numbers. So that's the way to do it, and there's many sources to get names. And email marketing is still 85-90% of the working tool to get an audience. I mean, certainly you want to communicate on the web. I mean, in LinkedIn groups, you want to use social media. But email marketing, a good, well thought out, executed email marketing campaign with nice graphics and a smartly designed HTML, that's where you're going to get your major registrants from.
Gotcha. And within this, the market disruption type arena, where do you see social media outside of LinkedIn fitting in there? I know I'm a LinkedIn kind of guy. I'm less of a Facebook and Twitter kind of guy. Can you speak to the importance or maybe some tips on leveraging the other social media to get the word out to qualified attendees?
Well, I think if you find groups that have a particular interest, I know there are some organizations out there now that are specialized in being able to capture those type of groups. I spoke to them not too long ago. They started doing this work in politics, and they would find people who had certain ideologies or certain beliefs, and they were able to capture them and then use social media to get to them. I do think, though, that LinkedIn can be a fabulous forum for using social media, particularly if you're encouraging people to join a conversation and not trying to sell them.
Great points. Another great question came in. I'm just going to read it verbatim because I think it speaks to so many conversations I've had. Mike, I think you're going to like to talk about this one. And I quote, "Our biggest challenge is finding subject matter experts in our company who have the time and resources to prep the slides." Ain't that the truth? When we've used an external industry expert or experts for webinars, their slides and presentation skills were lacking. Ugh. Do you think it's better to spend the content budget on hiring someone external to prep the slides for an internal presenter, or hire an industry expert who may deliver a decent webinar with boring slides? If you want to read through that, Mike, in the questions tab in the chat, you can click through there.
I got it.
Yeah.
So, let me address that. That actually is a lot of what we do.
I was just saying that's part of the reason I have a job too, Mike. I mean, this is what we do.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Going back to what I said, virtual meetings are different than live in-person meetings. Most everybody we deal with is a subject matter expert. Now, some of them are natural speakers. Some of them aren't. And it's a matter of going through a brainstorming session around coming up with an invitation that has clear deliverables that will attract the audience, and making sure that the speakers are bought into them. We do what we call a table read. Once we get the invitation pretty well nailed down, we get the speakers on a virtual meeting, get their comfort level, because we need to get them bought in. Remember, speakers are great, but they have a day job, okay? Our job is as much to motivate them and inspire them to want to be part of the webinar. Now, sometimes they'll push back and they're too busy, but you know what? When they realize that what their opportunity is to have their 15 minutes of fame, and they want this to look good, they will give you the time. So we go through these table reads where you discuss the flow, you discuss who's going to say what, where does the moderator come in. Not canned, but to make it more conversational. And when you go through a couple of these, we call them dress rehearsals, each time it takes it up a level and it polishes it. And then sometimes you may have a speaker that probably would appreciate a one-off session of coaching, and you work with them. So I would say to that question, don't ignore either of them. It's really more the process you use. I have found speakers. I'll give you an example. We did a webinar about a year ago on the benefit of direct mail, and it was kind of like, really, in the age of digital marketing, Yeah, it was one of the most highly subscribed to webinars. But we found, I had the person who was the owner of the company. It was great. I said, you know what? We need somebody else on here as a third-party expert. Well, we found somebody who wrote a book on direct mail marketing in the digital age. I said, wow. We recruited her. We asked her to come on and set the stage, and she did. She did a fabulous job. So there are people out there. You've got to be creative, to find these people. Editors and publishers of trade journals are great sources. Authors are great sources. What does an author get out of it? They get all these impressions on the invitation, and they get an opportunity, again, for their 15 minutes in front of an audience to promote their thought leadership, so people may want to buy their book. So I would say to that person, if I'm not completely answering it, feel free to give me a call. I'll give you lots of ideas on how to recruit people. In fact, once you get them, the care and feeding of your speakers is very important. But if they're motivated and they understand that this is a great opportunity for them, they'll give you all they got.
What a great point, Mike. Great point. On that note, as we're talking about speakers, of all these moving parts in a webinar that we've been talking about today, what do you think are the most important? And conversely, what do you think is most overlooked? I know there's a lot of pieces in there. Sometimes I focus on certain areas myself, and I overlook other areas. Where do you stand on that?
Well, it really is a life cycle. There are specific things that you need to do before, during, and after, and they are all important, and they're all part of the Managing the Life Cycle book that we have. But, again, well thought out planning starts with who is your audience, what are they going to get out of it, how are you going to determine success, what are the outcomes you're looking for, because if you don't have that, you're lost. So I would say starting with that sets the foundation then to come up with a topic. Is it a must-have, or is it a nice-to-have? Is it taking advantage of market disruptions or industry shifts? Who are the speakers we have? Do we have credible third parties? What value are we giving them? All of these things add up, and then it's getting the people around the virtual podium, if you will, to take that invitation and use that as the architecture to create the flow, to create something that's going to engage an audience. And then it's practicing on it. It's also doing sound checks, making sure people don't use wireless devices and they don't use speakerphones, which makes you sound distant, or cell phones. There's all sorts of things that go into producing a webinar. I can't say that there's any one thing, but it all starts at the beginning with planning.
I totally agree, and having moderated a lot of webinars, what you had just mentioned, I think speaks volumes. Getting people around the podium, practice with the technology, get comfortable with it. Because when you are a speaker and you've been invited on board, let's just take the assumption you're a good speaker and you're engaging and you have a compelling message and all that. You can throw all of those benefits out the window if you're a great speaker and you're fumbling through your technology. You don't know the flow. You haven't worked with your moderator. It gets back to those assumptions, Mike, that you brought up right in the beginning. If you build it, they will come. I'm a professional. I'll just wing it. I think those three items there are so overlooked, and it just takes, pulling those pieces in. It's really about filling in the holes. I really couldn't agree with you more on those pieces.
Yeah, it is. It's well. I'm gonna date myself and age myself, but you probably would remember this. It's the classic joke: the musician gets off the bus, the jazz musician gets off the bus in New York and says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?"
Oh, yeah.
The answer was practice, practice, practice. Mm-hmm. And that's really what this is. Doing webinars is not rocket science, but it is planning and execution and just managing all these moving parts to make sure that you can execute on what you promised.
I totally agree. I'm lucky. I listen to these things, and of course I'm nodding my head. This is what I do for a job every day. So I do this 6 hours a day kind of thing. So for me, I totally agree with you. I have to force myself to get out of my comfort zone. I try to learn new things just to remind myself that conducting a webinar, if you don't do it all the time, you really got to put some effort into it. You have to think about it, take your notes, get your project plan down, make your checklist. Because if it's not something you do all the time, you really want to have all those pieces together, for sure.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm actually doing 4 this week. Today's the first. Yeah. And each one of them, there's some similarity, but each one of them is a brand new experience, and you've got to get yourself psyched up for it and your head around it, or it's not going to come off. The audience will know. You can't fool an audience. Audiences know if you're not into it.
Oh yeah, no, they'll figure that out, and you will erode your credibility in about 30 seconds. It happens really fast. It happens really fast. I think I've got about 2 more questions here. Okay. Mike, should we address these, and then we'll see if there are other live questions, and we'll start wrapping up?
You got it.
Great. I love this question. It has to do with information in your audience, and the question reads, what type of intelligence do you recommend be collected before and during the webinar? I'm going to add and afterward, if I could.
Sure. There are 3 places along the life cycle to gather information. Before, I will tell you the greatest way to get insight is on your registration landing page, have an open-ended question. Say, what would you like to learn from this webinar? And don't have them tick in the box. Just have them fill it in and make it mandatory. We do that with every webinar, and we come away with nuggets of information that either validate that the messaging is on target, or I'd like to learn more about this, this, or this. And then we use that to either adjust the messaging and coach our speakers. Look, here's some important things you may have not thought were of interest that people want to know. The second is polls. Online polls are a great way. It lets the audience weigh in, as I said. It allows them to be engaged. You see where they are on things. And after the webinar, there's a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that I like is measuring the uptake on on-demand recordings. I gave that example of Novel, okay? Tremendous amount of registrations that were fresh new sales leads. That tells you how the staying power and the shelf life of the webinar. Those are just 3. You probably have some others that you can add too, Sean.
As you were thinking about that, my mind is racing. My mind is racing about this. I will address, the information. Polling, couldn't agree with you more. Within the presentation, I would also add quick places to gather information and feedback. A raised hand, a quick question through chat. Sure. It's a little bit of a variety, and maybe it's not as quantitative, but it's sure nice to have people clicking through. Your eyes and your brain can assimilate to half of the people, a quarter of the people very quickly without waiting for people to click buttons and answers and whatnot. I'm a fan of the polling questions. And most services these days have this. I'm not trying to get ReadyTalk centric, but the polling questions I like to use as a forced survey. So although technically it's live in the presentation, while I've got my audience there, right, I like to send out my top 2 or 3 questions that I really need to know the answers for. With that, outside of the post-meeting survey. So here's my other question is, Mike, in post-meeting surveys, what do you usually see as the response rate for those, whether they're emailed or it's like a web page that pops up?
The way we usually conduct a post-webinar survey is as soon as somebody logs off their browser, a little note pops up, would you mind taking a survey? It's totally voluntary and self-selecting. Sure. Yeah. We measure, here's our benchmarks, anywhere from 25% to 45%. Will take the survey. And obviously, the higher the percentage, the more interest and the more engagement. It's as simple as that. So they're a wonderful feedback tool to know how you did, what could you have done better, what did they like, what else do you want to learn. And not everybody's going to do it. Right. But the people that do, it's invaluable feedback.
I like the twofold benefit there with not only looking at your click-through rate, just as a general interest in the subject matter and topic, and the specific feedback you get. I think everybody should be looking at both of those pieces.
And just 10 seconds. All of those 6 metrics are put together as a series of analytics before the webinar and after the webinar that are used to help the client identify which of these people might have the most interest in the conversation, which need more long-term nurturing. So there's so many different things you can get out of doing a webinar because people have to have an interest or they wouldn't register and attend the webinar. So it's just a great way of qualifying. Is there an interest? Does somebody, can we have an opportunity to speak?
Excellent. I've got 2 more questions. They're actually self-surveys. These are my questions that just because I love webinars, this is my world here. Number one, I just want to make a comment first, and we'll end on a question here. The comment has to do with you had mentioned on-demand meetings and recorded content. I think that is a tremendously overlooked tool. I think in this self-serve age, I mean, we talk about it internally here about I do all my banking online. I get my news online. It's self-serve. I get it when I want it. I don't want to have to sit at my desk or on my couch and watch the TV show at prime time. I want to go to on-demand and watch it when I want. I got kids. I got a family. I got to work. I got to commute. All this stuff. I want what I want when I want it. Leverage your recorded webinars in that fashion. Make them accessible to your audience. And once again, track that as well. You are going to find a lot of great information about your subject matter, the topic, and you can get feedback on that as well. Before I ask my last question, any comments on that, Mike?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, like I said, we measure, when somebody comes to watch an on-demand, there's three things I want to know. Did you register and not attend? Did you attend and want to watch it again? Or are you a fresh new lead? The person who registered and didn't attend raised their hand and opted in. They have a level of interest. Somebody who wanted to review it again, definite interest. And somebody who's fresh, even more people to talk to. Yeah, there's so much you can do with that, from editing them and taking sound bites out of it. Oh, yeah, it's great.
So powerful, so powerful. Last point, or last question, really, and this gets back to your case studies, Mike. And I was looking at that and how you were coaching some of your clients through these. And in one point you had mentioned, well, instead of doing a webinar on X, and I can't remember the case study, which one it was, but you'd switched the topic to, I think it was the healthcare one. I think it was the Bosch healthcare one. Was that all completed in one webinar, or did you find that you had to split that out for different days and times to reach that number of people, or did you have one webinar, one big hit, or was that a multiple series of webinars with that content?
Well, the title on reimbursement was one webinar. Typically, our audience is North America, so we're talking about 4 time zones. Yeah. In some cases where we get multiple time zones from the rest of the world, I mean, some of these have had 60, 70 countries. Those are going to be served by on-demand. But to answer your question, no, we take one topic per webinar, and we drill down into it, and we know that if we start as we did today, 10 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Pacific, or whatever that is in your time zone, usually seems to work on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or a Thursday. So if I heard your question right, we focus on those days, and we get the audience to attend. Gotcha. And have you ever found that you've had subject matter that's so far-reaching that you've had to split it into like parts 1, 2, and 3? Maybe not so specific as that. I know sometimes I am challenged with I want to do this all the time, and I just want to keep connecting everything. How do you connect lots of information or complex information like that? Well, there's, again, what is your goal and objective in disseminating the information? And, you don't want to boil the ocean on any one topic because that'll overwhelm people. But just a couple of weeks ago, we did a series with a publisher called Unmanned Systems Week, and it was all about unmanned aircraft or drones. And there were 3 unique topics, one on Monday, one on Wednesday, one on Friday, and they were broken down, and these were 90-minute webinars, and very technical, very complex, the type that put my hair on fire. I mean, it's like, this is really technical stuff. And that's the way we did it. We identified it, and we gave it in chunks, in chunk sizes. There's, in an hour webinar, you've probably got 35 minutes of on-air time to get your information out with separating the polls and the introduction and the Q&A. So you really got to net it out, and you've got to hit what are the key topics, and that's where your invitation and your deliverables come in. What are you going to give the audience, and make sure you deliver on it. Absolutely. Mike, I'd like to turn the conference back over to you for any of your concluding remarks. Just to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it. You can probably tell I love this kind of an opportunity to share these ideas. It's always exciting. And, as the title says, I want you to walk away thinking about how you can use market disruptions and industry shifts in your particular business to help build your next webinar campaign. Get our book. It's free. Any questions, you know how to reach me. And I look forward, Sean, to coming back for other webinars. And thank you, and ReadyTalk.
Sounds great, and I do want to extend our sincere thanks for your time. Thanks for contributing to this webinar series. I love this topic. I think our customers and our attendees really loved it as well. That said, if you'd like to continue the conversation, want to learn about more of our web seminar series coming up, here's some information on where you can find all that. That said, on behalf of myself, Sean Cardinal, ReadyTalk, and our webinar series, Mike Agron, thank you again for speaking with us. With that said, I sincerely thank everybody's time, and we'll be sending you guys off the information and follow-up information shortly. Thanks again, and make it a great rest of your week.